Usually when people are talking about Japanese weapons, it tends to be either their very famous swords, like the tachi and katana, or it tends to be about their armor. But of course there are lots of other awesome Japanese weapons, including the yumi, the naginata, the wakizashi and the tanto, and rarer weapons like the kanabo and things like that. But there's one weapon which was actually incredibly prevalent and incredibly important in samurai warfare that doesn't get enough attention. Except on this channel, perhaps, because I love spears, and this is the yari, or Japanese spear. So we're going to run down 5 basic things and kind of headline things that you need to know about the Japanese spear, or yari, in this video. Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria and also Easton Antique Arms. Now obviously, because I'm an antique arms and armour dealer, I get these beautiful antique things and I get to feature them on this channel so you can see them, and that's also really useful because looking at original ones rather than replicas gives you a better idea really of what these things are about. So I've got a couple of different yari here. These have both been featured in previous videos, but I'm just going to run down relatively concisely, hopefully for me, 5 headline things that make the Japanese yari really quite distinct actually from spears from anywhere else in the world. Now of course spears have been incredibly successful and popular weapons throughout human history and prehistory, almost certainly the most important weapon across human history, actually, together with the bow. The bow and the spear together really dominate the history of human conflict and hunting, of course, because both are hunting implements, and that's probably originally what they were mostly used for, but obviously something that works for hunting also works for war in general. Now, the important thing to mention to begin with is about the attachment point between the blade and the shaft, okay? Now, most spears in the world that you probably will come into contact with have what's called a socket, just like this African spear here. So we have a socket that is forged as part of the blade, and this would be true if it was cast of bronze, in this case forged from iron, into a tube, and the socket goes into the tube. This has a number of advantages to it. It helps reduce friction as it goes into a target, which can also be a disadvantage, but we won't get into that now. But it does come with some disadvantages constructionally. So if they are forged like this and have this open kind of split section here, because of course they're forged out and then folded around, they meet here, and this is an open point, and if we look at Anglo-Saxon spears, for example, the earlier ones certainly are open down there as well. That can splay open under extreme either lateral or forward stress, so they're not impervious to failure, but most spears throughout history have used this socketed construction. However, not all of them. Of course, for tens of thousands of years, people were making spears with flint and stone and other materials like this before metals were worked, and they have to have a construction whereby the shaft essentially goes around the base of the blade. But in fact, that continues into later times with metal weapons, and so here we've got a Zulu assegai, or Iklewa, it should be more correctly known actually, but a lot of people call them assegai, and this is actually doesn't have a socket. So most Zulu spears actually have a tang or stalk, just like a sword grip or a knife grip, that goes down inside the shaft, and that's similar, in fact the same, as most Japanese yari. The typical Japanese yari, as featured here, actually has an extension of tang that goes inside the shaft and is concealed and hidden inside the handle, if you want to look at it like that. Now, you might be looking at this brass collar here. That isn't a socket. That is there to help the wood not split, but we'll come back to that later in the video. But fundamentally, this has a stalk or tang going down inside. And it just so happens I've got an example I can show you. Here we have a dismounted yari head inside a scabbard, incidentally. Okay, there we go. There is the yari blade. And that is all tang. And you'll notice it has a hole through it there, exactly like in a Japanese sword tang or nakago, where a peg, makugi peg, goes through. Okay, so that's a makugiana, and this goes down inside a hollow inside the shaft. The shafts on the Japanese spears are usually made of forms of oak, but they can be made of various other things as well. But this goes down inside and then it's pinned through. Now, one of the advantages of this is, as you can see here, it can be removed. Just like Japanese swords can be dismounted, so can Japanese yari. It also means that this is somewhat easier to manufacture, to be honest, compared to a socket. Not that sockets are particularly difficult to make. Remember, they were mass produced for arrows, for example, but it is a bit more laborious and a bit more time consuming. But funnily enough, I also mentioned about the socket splaying. Now, where a socket isn't joined into a solid piece, that is a weak point, and that obviously can't happen with this. What can happen, as I mentioned instead, and one of the weaknesses of the tanged construction, is that the shaft can split, either through lateral force or just hitting a hard target forwards, and that's why we have to have these kind of sleeves at the top to help prevent that splitting from happening. But the headline here is that most Japanese yari have a tanged construction, not a socketed construction. However, there are exceptions to that, and it just so happens the other yari I have here is the exception to that, or is an example of, and that actually is a socket. So you'll notice it's a solid socket, so it can't splay open because there's no opening. It's one solid tube that is forge welded to the blade, and this is called a fukuru yari, which means sleeve or socket essentially. Okay, so that is a socket or bag that goes around the end of the shaft, and obviously that can't split the shaft. So they did make socketed spearheads, but these are by far less numerous than the tanged construction one, where the tang is actually hidden inside the shaft, just like a sword in a sword hilt. And just one other thing to highlight about these tangs is they are really long. They have to be, because you imagine the lateral forces at play with a long pole arm. The leverage is crazy. So these tangs tend to be at least as long as the blades, and in some cases the blades are shorter than this one. So the tang is usually at least about 1 foot long, sometimes longer. They have to be for this tanged construction to work for a spear. Now, the second point to know about Japanese yari is that every single one that I have so far examined has a tapered shaft, and that's certainly not true of spears from elsewhere in the world. Very often they have parallel shafts. Sometimes they even have shafts which are actually thicker at the front end and thinner at the back end. But Japanese yari, every one that I've so far handled and seen, has been thicker at the back end and thinner at the front end. Now, you could say, doesn't that make it weaker? Potentially, but what it importantly does is it brings the point of balance back. We've talked about this in previous videos, where it's thicker at the back, like a snooker or pool cue. Okay, it means that it's much more back weighted, and it means that the point is much more nimble. What I would also say is actually the way that spears tend to break in use tends to actually be up here, and actually if you have more mass at the tip, in some ways they can be more likely to break under lateral stress sometimes, whereas where they're thinner, they tend to get knocked off more easily, or they flex. So if you imagine the limb of a longbow, although it's thick at the handle and thin at the end, if you bend the end, it bends because it's thinner at the end. And that seems to be what happens with these. So although they're thinner, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're weaker. But most importantly, it brings that point of balance back. So tapered shafts, most Japanese yari of any length that I've seen so far tend to be tapered, so they are thick at the back and thin at the front. Now, the next important thing to know about Japanese yari is they almost always have a counterbalance at the back end, a bit like a pommel on a sword. They have a butt cap, if you want to call it that. Essentially a cone of metal. I think they're usually cast. I think these are probably cast iron, but they can be made of other materials as well, like brass or bronze, and that adds to the balancing effect, but also it's for striking. I've got to be somewhat careful in here because it's a relatively long yari, and I obviously only have a certain amount of headroom, but the yari are used as turning weapons. They are not only held as pikes and used point forward, but in situations, for example, where someone knocks your point offline, you'll instantly bring the back around and strike with the back, either with a thrust or a hit. And that, of course, adds to the fact that this is thicker at this end, so it makes this end a bit more like a mace, like a pointy mace, a bit like a Godendag, actually, for those of you who know what that is, 14th century Flemish fans watching the channel. So the back end is better for striking. It's also got this heavy weight on it, but that achieves two things. Number one, it makes it more effective for striking with the back end like a pommel, but additionally it adds to the nimbleness of the point and makes the weapon more agile and more comfortable to hold, but it also also realistically gives you greater reach as well, because it means I can hold, this is a real Yari, and it's what, I'm 6'1", so that's got to be at least 6.5, probably over that feet tall. And I can literally one-handed hold this at the back end, at the pommel, essentially, and reach one-handed thrust, which gives me a reach, an attacking reach with a one-handed thrust against a horseman or anyone else. A reach, incredible reach of probably, plus the length of my arm, well over 7 foot. So it gives it, although this is not a particularly light weapon, it gives us an enormous reach advantage, because I can hold the weapon either two-handed or one-handed right at the back of the weapon, and it means that the literal length of the weapon, it's actually, in effective fighting terms, got a greater reach than you would think, because it's so well balanced. Partly thanks to that metal shoe or butt cap. Now, one of the other things which is characteristic of pretty much all Yari, certainly all the ones that I've seen or that have survived in the antiques world and museums, is that they pretty much all have forms of binding on the shaft. You'll notice that down in the portion where we're mostly holding them and the back end, it is bare wood. This one at the top incidentally had a butt cap but is missing it. I never had it. Well, I've had it, so it obviously fell off at some point, but the other one still has it on. So they're bare wood with a butt cap at the end, bare wood all the way up until about the last 2 or 3 feet where they are bound. And these are bound in different ways. We're going to look at these. So this one is bound with lacquered leather with copper reinforcing rings and a copper sleeve up there. Just put that one down carefully. This one is bound completely differently. This one instead is bound with it's got the copper bands or rings around here and the copper sleeve or brass sleeve. But instead of leather, this has actually got shagreen or ray skin or shark skin essentially around here. And this is spirally bound. This is a long strip. I don't know if you can see on camera. It's a long strip that you can see is bound around that way. And shark skin is quite resistant. Obviously, they have it on certain types of sword grip. Japanese swords have it underneath the wrap, the top wrap. So they have samagawa underneath. So this binding, so we've talked about this in a few previous videos. Some people asserted it's for gripping. It's not really. Yes, you can grip it, but most of the shaft that's for gripping is bare wood. So clearly they were happy with bare wood. What this is primarily here for, we've concluded now after lots of discussion with various experts around the world on Japanese weapons, is primarily this is to protect the shaft. Firstly, from it splitting, because remember that tang goes down inside the shaft, and any kind of twisting movement, if it was just bare wood, would split it in use. Okay, so the main purpose is it's to bind the top of the shaft pretty much for the length of the tang or a bit longer than that and prevent the shaft from splitting. But secondly, it also protects the shaft from enemies' weapons, swords and knives and such like, from cutting the wood quite so much. And these copper rings probably help with that as well. And also, to some extent, probably helps opponents' weapons not slide down towards your hands quite as much. But in terms of this video, this is another highlight, another point in the characteristic nature of Japanese Yari, is they pretty much always, or perhaps always, have binding on the upper portion that we don't really see on many other types of spear. The closest thing that we could perhaps get to it are languettes that we see on some pole arms, whether it's from Europe or China or anywhere else, which are thin metal strips which come down. Their main purpose is either to secure the head on with things like poleaxes, just grab a poleaxe from here, with things like poleaxes to keep the head secured to the shaft, but also to protect it from opponents' weapons as well. But this is a little bit like that, but not quite. And the big advantage of the Japanese Yari version, it might not be as protective as an iron languette, but it's a lot lighter. So these really seem to be giving the maximum strength and nimbleness for the minimum amount of weight. To be honest, with a spear, which is mostly a thrusting weapon, lightness is something you shouldn't sacrifice, because one of the big advantages of the spear is it is light and you're able to hold it out at arm's length and it's very manageable. So the fifth and final really characteristic thing about Japanese Yari is they tend to have, and pretty much usually have, armor piercing points, okay, and they are triangular in cross section. Both of these are flat on one face and ridged on the other face, and on the flat face, they, as you can hopefully see, I'll just bring one closer to the camera, they have a groove or fuller, blood groove as some people might like to call it. So let's have a look, there we go, and the blood groove is often painted red, as you can see there, for reasons that are slightly controversial and obscure. So ridged on the flat side, sorry, grooved on the flat side and ridged on the other side. So it is, looking that way, a flattened triangle, quite similar, funnily enough, to some chisels. And to be honest, I've often thought about the fact that if you ever wanted to make a yari on a budget, you could probably find a chisel that will suit and work, grind it out of a chisel. So if I just pick up the blade, the bare blade here, because it's a bit easier to demonstrate, you can see actually at the base down here, the kind of bit next to where the socket would be. So obviously you've got a square tang that goes into the socket, and then the kind of neck, if you want to call it that, here is actually, in this case, I think a kind of octagon, hexagon maybe. And then from there it's ground into this flattened triangle shape there. Which really gives a superbly rigid, very similar to some bayonets actually, but gives a superbly rigid cross-section. And we also see triangular cross-sections on bayonets and on small swords and on certain lances. And it means it's got no flex in it whatsoever. It's very, very strong and very good at piercing through armor. And I've always thought this is kind of quite funny because the yari, the Japanese yari, seems, unlike spears from lots of other places in the world which have, you know, leaf-shaped heads or whatever, these can pierce armor, but they're not really specifically designed for it. But I've always thought it's kind of ironic that the Japanese have a spear, a yari, which looks like a specialised armoured fighting spear, and which it was really, let's be honest, when a lot of other cultures which generally speaking had more armour didn't necessarily only use specialised armoured piercing points, but moreover their other weapons like the sword and the wakizashi and stuff are kind of not very well adapted to fighting armour actually. I mean, you can't, you know, European armour, mail for example, you can't really cut through mail with an edge like that. The points are not really greatly shaped. The kisaki is not really great shape for piercing through armour, and yet ironically the Japanese yari is indeed fantastically adapted to piercing armour. So it almost seems like this was their anti-armour weapon, and it possibly is why it got popular at a certain point, because this was more effective at going through armour than their swords and naginata were. These were probably far better specialised armoured fighting weapons. And it's also worth noting that sometimes we see the yari adapted into a specific type of armoured fighting dagger that the Japanese carried with a normal tanto grip. So essentially a yari bladed tanto, used exactly like a European rondel dagger to punch through mail and lamina and other forms of armour that they were using. So this is we know this is the specialised armoured piercing point because they also used it on specialised armour piercing daggers. They just reused a yari blade. So there we go. So there are 5 headline things about Japanese yari. It's a great weapon. I think they're kind of underappreciated and they don't get as much attention, and they're not actually that expensive. You can buy original examples because they're not collected in the same way that swords are. They're also a lot more difficult to ship and to transport, but which I'm sure plays a part in that. But the fact is they were really important in Japanese warfare, particularly for samurai between the 15th, 16th century all the way through to the 19th century. We often see samurai with yari in this period, and in the earlier periods the yari was very popular for the standard infantry pikemen, essentially on a longer pole. So the yari was always around in Japan, always important, but it became a particularly important samurai weapon from the sort of 15th, 16th century, about the same time that people switched from the tachi to the katana, which might be connected things. Anyway, maybe we'll talk about that in a future video. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. If you like my videos and you like this kind of content, and I usually only release 2 or 3 videos a week, if you'd like a little bit more, then maybe consider the Patreon, because I do release 3 extra videos per month on Patreon. And I just put a video up talking about these things about Anglo-Indian hunting knives, particularly by the company called Arnacellum. There's just one example, and there's lots of other stuff on the Patreon. There's hundreds and hundreds of videos. So if you join up there, it's only minimum three euros. I was going to say dollars a month. Then you get access to the full back catalogue, which goes back years and years and years. But anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I'll continue to be, and I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.